You made it. You survived the journey, you crossed the mountains, and you finally reached the California goldfields. This should be the moment when all your sacrifices pay off, when the dream becomes reality, when you strike it rich and prove that leaving everything behind was worth it. But what if the goldfields aren't what the newspapers promised? What if the real gold rush isn't about finding nuggets in streams, but about discovering how quickly civilization disappears when desperation takes over? Today, you're about to learn that reaching California was just the beginning of your nightmare. Because in a mining camp where a loaf of bread costs more than you used to make in a week, where your neighbors eye your meager claim like vultures, and where success is measured by how many days you can survive rather than how much gold you can find, the real question isn't whether you'll strike it rich. It's whether you'll survive long enough to realize you never should have come. The shock of arrival. Your first sight of a California mining camp destroys every romantic notion you harbored about gold rush civilization during the long months of travel that brought you here. What spreads before you isn't a town, but a sprawling collection of tents, lean-tos, and crude shelters that look like they might blow away in the next strong wind, inhabited by men who move with the desperate efficiency of people who have abandoned all pretense of civilized living. The smell hits you before you fully comprehend the visual chaos: unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and smoke from hundreds of small fires that burn constantly despite the scarcity of proper fuel. It's the concentrated odor of too many people living in too small a space, with no infrastructure for sanitation, waste disposal, or basic hygiene that civilized humans require for healthy existence. Mud dominates the landscape wherever snow has melted, creating a sticky morass that swallows boots and makes walking treacherous. The ground has been churned by thousands of feet into a consistency that's neither solid nor liquid, but something in between that clings to everything and dries into a hard crust that cracks and reforms with each day's cycle of freezing and thawing. Men move through this chaos with single-minded purpose that excludes social interaction or acknowledgement of newcomers. They carry tools, buckets, and supplies with the mechanical attention of people who have learned that survival depends on constant activity directed towards specific goals rather than the casual social behaviors that define community life in civilized places. Your fellow travelers stand beside you in stunned silence, each processing the reality that this collection of desperate humanity represents the destination you've sacrificed everything to reach. The farmer's labored breathing continues, but now it competes with the sounds of industry, picks striking rock, shovels scraping gravel, and the constant background noise of hundreds of men working with tools designed for individual rather than cooperative use. Coleman observes the scene with professional detachment, but you notice tension in his posture that suggests even his experience didn't fully prepare him for conditions that represent the current state of California gold rush reality. The mathematics of desperation. You learn within hours that everything costs more than you calculated during months of careful planning around kitchen tables in civilized places where prices followed logical relationship to actual value. A pound of flour sells for what you used to spend on a week's groceries. Coffee costs more per ounce than silver. Simple tools that would be commonplace in any eastern town command prices that seem designed to bankrupt anyone foolish enough to need them. The merchants who control these supplies operate with the casual indifference of people who understand that desperate customers have no alternatives and therefore no negotiating power. They name prices without shame or justification, knowing that men who have traveled thousands of miles to reach this place will pay whatever is demanded rather than admit failure and return home empty-handed. Your remaining money, carefully conserved throughout the journey west, evaporates with terrifying speed as you purchase basic necessities for survival in conditions that your eastern preparations never anticipated. A single meal costs more than you used to spend on food for several days, and the quality suggests you're paying premium prices for provisions that would be considered animal feed in civilized locations. Housing doesn't exist in any recognizable form, just space rental for setting up your own shelter using materials you must provide or purchase at equally inflated prices. Canvas, for a simple tent, costs more than you used to pay for quality furniture, and the rental fees for ground space seem calculated to ensure that even successful miners remain perpetually close to financial ruin. The banker among your group calculates these economics with growing horror, his methodical approach to numbers revealing the mathematical impossibility of making money under current conditions. Even if gold proves abundant and easily extracted, the cost of basic survival appears designed to consume profits faster than mining can generate them. You begin to understand why so many men look desperate, despite being surrounded by the gold deposits that supposedly justify the hardships required to reach this place. The economics of extraction operate under rules that favor suppliers over producers, creating conditions where finding gold might not translate into keeping enough wealth to justify the sacrifices required to pursue it. The texture of squalor. Your sleeping arrangements consist of whatever shelter you can improvise, using materials that weren't designed for housing and space, that's barely adequate for storing supplies, let alone providing rest for bodies that have been pushed beyond reasonable limits for months without adequate recovery time. The ground beneath your makeshift tent feels harder than any surface you remember sleeping on, made worse by cold that seeps through layers of bedding and clothing that seemed adequate for travel, but prove insufficient for stationary existence in conditions where warmth becomes a luxury that must be earned through constant effort rather than simple preparation. Privacy disappears entirely as hundreds of men live in closer proximity than families typically endure, creating constant awareness of other people's bodily functions, personal habits, and individual responses to stress that civilized society normally keeps private. Every conversation can be overheard, every personal routine becomes public knowledge, and every moment of weakness or frustration gets observed by neighbors who are dealing with identical problems. Bathing becomes impossible rather than merely inconvenient, as water for washing competes with water for drinking, cooking, and the industrial processes that everyone came here to pursue. Personal hygiene degrades to levels that would have been unthinkable during your previous life, though everyone around you maintains the same standards, creating a community where cleanliness becomes irrelevant to social acceptance. Your clothes begin deteriorating rapidly under conditions they weren't designed to withstand. Constant moisture, extreme temperature variations, and daily contact with mud, rock, and tools that tear fabric and wear through leather with relentless efficiency. Replacement clothing costs more than entire wardrobes did back home, forcing you to make repairs with materials and techniques that produce results barely adequate for basic coverage. Food preparation occurs under conditions that would horrify any housewife, using equipment that's been exposed to weather, dirt, and handling that eliminates any possibility of the cleanliness that civilized cooking requires. Meals become fuel rather than pleasure, consumed for their caloric value rather than taste or social significance. The constant presence of mud, dust, and grime creates a layer of filth that becomes part of your physical existence, coating skin, hair, and clothing with substances that can't be removed without resources that don't exist in this environment. The daily rhythm of labor. You wake before dawn, not by choice, but because sleeping becomes impossible once the camp begins its daily routine of men preparing for work that demands every hour of daylight and most hours of darkness. The sounds of tools being gathered, fires being lit, and hundreds of individual preparations for labor create a background noise that penetrates even the deepest exhaustion. Your hands, still recovering from the mountain crossing, must now adapt to different tools designed for breaking rock and moving gravel rather than managing wagons and caring for animals. The pick feels foreign and unwieldy, requiring techniques you must learn through trial and error while competing against men who have developed efficiency through weeks or months of practice. The work itself consists of repetitive motions that seem simple in concept but prove exhausting in practice. Swing the pick, shovel the gravel, carry the bucket, repeat endlessly while hoping that one shovelful will contain enough gold to justify the enormous effort required to extract it from unwilling earth. Your back aches within hours from bending, lifting, and swinging tools in positions that human bodies weren't designed to maintain for extended periods. The farmer, still weakened from his mountain illness, struggles visibly with physical demands that would challenge healthy men under normal circumstances. Progress gets measured in buckets of gravel processed rather than distance traveled or tasks completed, creating a new relationship with time where hours pass without visible advancement toward any goal except the completion of another day's labor that might or might not produce results worth the effort invested. The banker attempts to calculate the economics of daily output versus effort expended, but his numbers reveal uncomfortable truths about the relationship between work performed and value extracted. Most days produce barely enough gold dust to cover basic living expenses, leaving nothing for accumulating the wealth that justified this entire venture. Evening brings exhaustion so complete that sleep becomes mandatory rather than chosen, though rest occurs on the same hard ground and under the same uncomfortable conditions that make recovery incomplete and inadequate for the demands that tomorrow will certainly bring. The arithmetic of extraction. Gold proves far more difficult to separate from ordinary dirt than newspaper accounts suggested during your comfortable planning sessions back home. The process requires equipment, techniques, and patience that transform the romantic notion of picking up nuggets into the industrial reality of processing tons of material to extract tiny quantities of precious metal. Your gold pan becomes the most important tool you own, but learning to use it effectively requires practice that costs time and energy while producing minimal results. The technique of swirling water and gravel to separate heavy gold from lighter materials seems simple when explained, but proves maddeningly difficult to master when attempted under conditions where every motion must be economical and efficient. Water for washing gravel must be carried from sources that may be considerable distances from your claim, adding transportation time to the labor already required for digging, processing, and sorting material that mostly contains nothing valuable. The arithmetic of effort versus result creates equations that rarely balance in favor of the miner. Most of what you extract from the ground turns out to be worthless rock that must be moved anyway to reach deposits that might contain gold, creating vast amounts of unnecessary labor that nevertheless can't be avoided if you want access to potentially valuable material buried beneath layers of ordinary earth. The tools wear out faster than anticipated, requiring repair or replacement at costs that consume whatever profits might result from successful extraction. Picks lose their points, shovels bend or break, and pans develop holes that make effective separation impossible, all while operating under economic conditions where equipment failure can eliminate weeks of careful savings. Other miners guard their techniques and locations with understandable secrecy, creating an environment where learning occurs through expensive mistakes rather than shared knowledge that might benefit everyone. Information becomes another commodity to be hoarded rather than freely exchanged among people pursuing similar goals. Your daily yield gets measured in pinches of gold dust that look insignificant compared to the massive amounts of earth that must be processed to obtain them, creating a dispiriting relationship between effort and reward that challenges the optimism required to continue this work day after day. The weight of competition. Every piece of potentially valuable ground has already been claimed by men who arrived earlier and established rights through systems that favor those with prior knowledge, superior equipment, or simply better luck in choosing locations before the best opportunities disappeared under the pressure of too many people pursuing limited resources. Your late arrival means accepting whatever claims remain available, which generally consist of areas that earlier miners examined and rejected as unlikely to produce sufficient gold to justify the effort required for extraction. The good ground gets worked by men who understand both the techniques and the economics better than newcomers struggling to learn both simultaneously. Claim jumping represents a constant threat that requires vigilance. You can barely afford while also performing the physical labor necessary to make your claim productive. Men with superior tools, greater experience, or simply more desperate circumstances than your own eye. Your modest diggings with attention that suggests they're calculating whether taking your claim might prove easier than working their own. The informal legal system that governs mining rights operates through mechanisms that favor those with established relationships, physical strength, or willingness to use violence, rather than the principles of justice that civilized society uses to resolve disputes. Your status as newcomer provides no protection against men who view your claim as opportunity rather than property. Water rights create additional layers of competition as successful mining requires access to streams that multiple parties want to use simultaneously. Upstream miners can divert water that downstream operations need for processing gravel, creating conflicts that pit individual success against community cooperation in ways that rarely resolve amicably. Supply shortages mean competing not just for gold, but for basic necessities like food, tools, and shelter materials that everyone needs, but which exist in quantities insufficient to meet current demand. Every purchase becomes a competition against men whose need may be as desperate as your own, but whose resources might be superior. The constant pressure of competition eliminates the cooperative spirit that might make this harsh existence more bearable, replacing community support with individual suspicion that makes every interaction potentially adversarial rather than mutually beneficial. The texture of hunger. Food becomes a constant preoccupation that dominates your thoughts in ways that would have seemed impossible during your previous life, when meals appeared regularly and variety was expected rather than hoped for. The simple question of what to eat transforms from automatic routine into complex calculation involving cost, availability, nutritional value, and cooking capabilities under conditions that make food preparation a significant challenge. Your diet reduces to basic staples that can be stored without refrigeration, prepared with minimal equipment, and purchased at prices that don't immediately bankrupt you. Flour, beans, bacon, and coffee when you can afford it. The monotony of eating the same foods daily becomes less important than the simple fact of having enough calories to fuel the physical labor that mining demands. Cooking occurs over fires that must be built with scarce fuel, maintained despite wind and weather, and shared with other miners who face identical limitations. The process requires time and attention that competes with mining activities, creating pressure to prepare food quickly and efficiently, rather than with attention to taste or nutritional balance. Fresh meat exists only when someone succeeds at hunting, which happens rarely enough that such meals become noteworthy events rather than regular occurrences. Vegetables disappear entirely from your diet except for occasional potatoes or onions that cost more than you used to spend on complete meals back home. Your body adapts to chronic hunger that never quite reaches starvation, but never achieves satisfaction either. The constant background awareness of inadequate nutrition affects concentration, energy levels, and decision-making in ways that compound the other stresses of mining camp existence. Meal planning becomes a survival skill that requires balancing immediate hunger against future needs, current prices against anticipated income, and individual requirements against group resources when sharing becomes necessary for basic survival. Every bite represents careful calculation rather than simple consumption. The banker documents food costs with the same methodical attention he once gave to business accounts, but his numbers reveal the disturbing reality that eating adequately consumes most of whatever gold gets extracted, leaving little for the accumulation of wealth that supposedly justifies all these hardships. The democracy of filth. Personal cleanliness becomes impossible to maintain under conditions where water for washing competes with water for drinking, cooking, and mining operations that represent your only chance of earning enough to survive another day. The standards of hygiene that define civilized existence disappear entirely, replaced by acceptance of filth levels that would have horrified you during your previous life. Your clothes accumulate layers of dirt, grease, and sweat that can't be removed without resources that don't exist in quantities sufficient for cleaning. Washing garments requires water, soap, time, and drying space that are all either unavailable or too expensive to use for purposes that don't directly contribute to gold extraction efforts. Everyone around you maintains similar standards of cleanliness, creating a community where personal hygiene becomes irrelevant to social acceptance because alternatives simply don't exist for anyone regardless of their previous social status or personal preferences about physical presentation. Your hair grows longer and more unkempt as barbering services either don't exist or cost more than seems reasonable for purely cosmetic improvements. Shaving becomes irregular and eventually stops entirely as the time, equipment, and water required compete with more essential activities needed for basic survival. Skin develops a permanent coating of grime that becomes part of your physical existence, changing color and texture in ways that make you barely recognizable as the person who left home months ago with careful attention to personal appearance and social presentation. Dental hygiene degrades to levels that create genuine health concerns. As toothbrushes wear out and can't be replaced, toothpaste becomes an unaffordable luxury, and the foods available don't support oral health in environments where dental problems could prove serious or even fatal. The accumulated effect transforms not just your appearance, but your relationship with your own body, as cleanliness stops being achievable goal and becomes nostalgic memory of comfort that existed in civilized places that now seem impossibly distant and luxurious. Sleep occurs in bedding that can't be cleaned adequately. creating intimate contact with fabrics that accumulate months of use without proper washing in conditions where cleanliness would require resources better devoted to survival activities. The rhythm of sameness. Days blend together in repetitive cycles that eliminate the variety and social markers that normally distinguish one day from another in civilized life. Every morning begins with the same preparation for labor. Every afternoon consists of identical physical activities, and every evening ends with the same exhausted collapse into inadequate rest. Your weekly routine disappears entirely as mining operations continue 7 days without variation, creating a temporal existence where traditional concepts of rest, worship, or leisure become meaningless luxuries that survival can't accommodate. Time gets measured by productivity rather than calendar dates or social customs. The weather provides the only variation in daily experience, creating differences between days that are miserably cold, unbearably hot, or simply uncomfortable rather than the pleasant seasonal changes that marked time in your previous life. Weather becomes enemy rather than natural phenomenon, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. Holidays and celebrations that once provided anticipation and social connection disappear entirely, replaced by the grinding necessity of constant work toward goals that may or may not prove achievable regardless of effort invested. Traditional markers of special occasions become irrelevant when every day requires identical survival activities. Your thoughts simplify to focus on immediate concerns rather than complex planning or emotional processing that characterized your mental life in civilized circumstances. What to eat, how to stay warm, whether your claim will produce gold today, basic questions that leave little mental energy for broader contemplation or personal reflection. Social interaction reduces to practical communication about work-related topics, weather conditions, and essential survival information. Conversations that don't serve immediate practical purposes feel like wasteful expenditure of energy that should be conserved for physical activities that might contribute to survival or modest prosperity. The banker continues his methodical documentation, but his journal entries become shorter and more focused on practical observations rather than personal reflection or analysis of broader implications of mining camp existence. Even record keeping adapts to conditions that prioritize efficiency over thoroughness. You begin to understand how quickly civilized behavior disappears when survival requires constant attention to basic needs that civilized society normally manages automatically through community infrastructure and cooperative institutions. The mathematics of futility. Your daily gold extraction rarely exceeds a few dollars worth of dust and tiny flakes that look pathetically small compared to the massive amounts of earth you must process to obtain them. The arithmetic becomes depressingly clear. Hours of back-breaking labor produce barely enough value to cover basic living expenses, leaving nothing for the accumulation of wealth that supposedly justified abandoning your previous life. The process of weighing and measuring your daily yield creates a ritual that highlights the disparity between effort and reward. Tiny scales become instruments of judgment that determine whether you can afford adequate food, whether your tools can be repaired or replaced, and whether survival remains possible for another day or week. Most claims produce nothing at all on most days, creating long stretches where labor continues based on hope rather than evidence that continued effort will prove worthwhile. The psychological toll of working without reward accumulates like compound interest on a debt that can never be repaid through ordinary human persistence. Your fellow miners share similar experiences of minimal returns despite maximum effort, creating a community bonded by shared disappointment rather than mutual success. Conversations about daily yields become exercises in creative accounting, where tiny amounts get presented as encouraging progress toward goals that remain impossibly distant. The banker's calculations reveal the mathematical impossibility of making money under current conditions, even if gold extraction improves dramatically. Living expenses consume whatever small amounts get extracted, creating an economic treadmill where working harder simply allows survival to continue rather than prosperity to accumulate. Equipment costs, food prices, and claim rental fees operate according to economics designed to transfer whatever wealth miners extract back to merchants and suppliers who never touch a shovel but profit consistently from other people's labor. The system seems structured to ensure that finding gold doesn't translate into keeping gold. You begin to understand why so many miners look desperate despite being surrounded by the gold deposits that supposedly represent unlimited opportunity. The reality of extraction operates under rules that make individual success nearly impossible while making collective failure almost inevitable. The texture of isolation. Letters from home arrive irregularly and cost more to receive than you can easily afford, creating a financial barrier to maintaining connection with family members who seem increasingly distant and irrelevant to your current existence. The expense of communication competes with basic survival needs in calculations that rarely favor emotional connection over physical necessity. Your wife's letters describe daily life that sounds impossibly luxurious compared to your current circumstances. Regular meals, clean clothing, warm houses, and social activities that seem like fantasy rather than reality you once shared. The contrast between her world and yours becomes so extreme that meaningful communication across the gap feels increasingly impossible. Writing responses requires paper, ink, and postal fees that represent significant expenses when measured against your minimal daily income. Every letter you send costs the equivalent of several meals, forcing you to choose between maintaining family connections and maintaining adequate nutrition for continued physical labor. The content of your letters becomes carefully edited to avoid describing conditions that would horrify recipients while also avoiding false optimism about circumstances that show no sign of improvement. Finding neutral language for experiences that are neither tolerable nor hopeful requires creativity that exhaustion makes increasingly difficult to sustain. News from home feels irrelevant to your current reality, where local politics, community events, and social changes that once seemed important have been replaced by immediate concerns about survival that allow no mental space for broader consideration of world events beyond this isolated camp. Time operates differently here, with months passing that feel like years, while simultaneously seeming like brief moments in routines so repetitive that individual days become indistinguishable from each other. Your previous life feels both impossibly recent and impossibly distant, like memories from childhood that may or may not have actually happened. The distance between your current existence and your previous identity grows larger each day, making it increasingly difficult to imagine returning to civilized society or resuming relationships with people who have continued developing while you've been reduced to basic survival concerns that eliminate personal growth or social sophistication. The weight of weather. Winter in the mining camps proves more severe than your mountain crossing prepared you to expect, with cold that penetrates every inadequate shelter and makes basic survival a constant struggle that consumes energy needed for productive work. The combination of altitude, exposure, and insufficient housing creates conditions that challenge human endurance on a daily basis. Your makeshift shelter provides minimal protection against wind that cuts through canvas and improvised walls with ease, creating drafts that make maintaining adequate body temperature impossible despite multiple layers of clothing that restrict movement and comfort. Sleeping becomes an exercise in managing cold rather than achieving rest. Fuel for heating remains expensive and scarce, forcing choices between warmth and food that shouldn't be necessary but become routine parts of daily survival calculations. Small fires provide temporary relief, but consume resources that might be needed for cooking or emergency situations that could arise without warning. Working outdoors in freezing temperatures makes handling tools dangerous, as metal becomes cold enough to cause injury on contact with bare skin. Your hands lose feeling regularly, creating safety hazards when operating equipment that requires precise control to prevent accidents that could prove serious or fatal. Ice forms on your beard and mustache during outdoor work, creating weight and discomfort that seems minor but contributes to the accumulated misery that makes every task more difficult than it would be under reasonable conditions. Even breathing becomes consciously uncomfortable as cold air burns throat and lungs. Snow accumulates around your shelter and work area, requiring constant clearing to maintain access to essential supplies and equipment. The additional labor of snow removal competes with mining activities for time and energy that exist in quantities insufficient to meet all necessary demands. Your clothes freeze when wet and remain damp when dry, creating a persistent state of discomfort that affects concentration and physical capability. Laundry becomes impossible during cold weather, adding another layer of filth to existence that already challenges every standard of civilized living. The banker documents temperature readings and weather conditions with scientific precision, but his numbers only confirm what everyone experiences directly: conditions that push human tolerance beyond reasonable limits while offering no relief or improvement until seasonal changes that may or may not occur as expected. The democracy of sickness. Illness spreads through the camp with predictable efficiency as hundreds of men live in close proximity without adequate sanitation, nutrition, or medical care that civilized communities provide to prevent disease outbreaks. Your weakened physical condition from months of inadequate diet and constant stress makes resistance to infection nearly impossible when exposure becomes inevitable. The farmer's persistent cough evolves into something more serious that leaves him unable to work for days at a time, creating economic hardship that compounds his physical suffering. His illness affects not just his own survival, but the economics of your small group, as reduced productivity threatens everyone's ability to generate sufficient income for basic necessities. Simple injuries become serious problems when they can't be treated properly due to lack of medical supplies, clean conditions, or professional care that would prevent complications. A cut that would heal quickly under normal circumstances can become infected and dangerous when exposed to the constant filth and poor nutrition that define mining camp existence. Dysentery affects nearly everyone periodically, creating periods of weakness and dehydration that make physical labor dangerous or impossible, while also requiring resources for treatment that compete with money needed for food and shelter. The disease spreads easily in conditions where sanitation ranges from inadequate to non-existent. Your body develops various minor ailments that would have been easily treated in civilized circumstances, but become chronic problems when ignored due to lack of alternatives. Persistent headaches, joint pain, and digestive problems accumulate into constant background discomfort that affects every aspect of daily life. The few men with medical knowledge become overwhelmed by demand for their services, while lacking supplies and proper facilities to provide effective treatment. Their amateur efforts help some patients while proving inadequate for serious conditions that require professional intervention unavailable in this isolated location. Sleep deprivation from illness, cold, and general discomfort weakens immune systems further, creating cycles where recovery from one ailment barely occurs before the next health problem develops. Your body exists in a state of constant low-level crisis that prevents full healing from any individual condition. Mental health deteriorates alongside physical problems as the stress of survival, isolation from family, and constant disappointment combine to create psychological pressures that civilized society normally helps people manage through community support and professional resources that don't exist here. The arithmetic of despair. Your savings from home disappear entirely within months of arrival, consumed by living expenses that exceed even the most pessimistic calculations you made during your optimistic planning sessions. The money that represented security and opportunity becomes merely another resource, exhausted by the grinding economics of survival in conditions that favor suppliers over workers. Credit becomes available from merchants who understand that desperate men will accept almost any terms for basic necessities, creating debt relationships that trap miners in cycles where working barely generates enough income to service obligations rather than accumulate wealth. The credit system seems designed to ensure permanent indebtedness rather than temporary assistance. Your tools require constant maintenance and frequent replacement at costs that consume whatever small amounts of gold you manage to extract from increasingly unproductive claims. Equipment failure can eliminate weeks of modest profits in a single day, creating financial setbacks that prove impossible to recover from under current economic conditions. The banker's documentation reveals the systematic nature of economic exploitation that ensures most miners remain poor despite finding gold regularly. Prices, fees, and costs operate according to principles that transfer wealth from producers to middlemen who never engage in actual mining but profit consistently from other people's labor. Medical expenses for treating illnesses and injuries that result from working conditions add another layer of financial burden that competes with basic survival needs. Getting sick becomes a luxury that most miners can't afford, creating incentives to continue working despite health problems that would normally require rest and treatment. Sending money home to support families becomes impossible when current income barely covers immediate survival needs. The obligation to provide for dependents who trusted your judgment about this venture creates guilt and anxiety that compound the other stresses of daily existence in conditions that offer little hope for improvement. You begin to understand why so many miners resort to gambling, drinking, or other destructive behaviors that provide temporary escape from economic realities that offer no reasonable solutions through ordinary hard work or careful financial management. Desperation creates its own logic that normal, moral reasoning can't address adequately. The texture of time. Months pass without significant progress toward any goal except continued survival, creating a strange relationship with time where days feel endless while weeks disappear without producing meaningful change in circumstances or prospects for improvement. The future becomes impossible to imagine beyond the immediate concerns of securing enough food and shelter for another day. Your concept of achievement adjusts to accommodate reality, where success gets measured by not failing rather than by accomplishing positive goals. Making it through another week without serious injury, illness, or financial catastrophe becomes worthy of celebration rather than the minimum expectation for ordinary life. The seasonal cycle provides the only reliable marker of time's passage, as weather changes create different types of misery rather than the pleasant variations that marked calendar progression in your previous life. Spring brings mud instead of flowers, summer brings dust instead of comfortable warmth, and autumn brings dread about winter rather than harvest satisfaction. Planning beyond immediate necessities becomes impossible when current conditions change unpredictably and resources exist in quantities insufficient to provide security for more than brief periods. Your mental horizon shrinks to encompass only the problems that must be solved today rather than the goals that might be achieved eventually. Memory of your previous life becomes increasingly dreamlike and difficult to reconcile with current reality. The comfortable existence you abandoned seems so impossibly luxurious that recollections feel like stories about someone else's life rather than your own experience from just months ago. The banker's journal entries become briefer and more focused on immediate observations rather than long-term analysis or personal reflection. Even his methodical approach to documentation adapts to conditions where detailed record-keeping competes with survival activities for time and mental energy. Letters from home arrive less frequently and feel more disconnected from your current existence, as the gap between your experience and your family's reality grows too large for meaningful communication. Their concerns and activities seem to occur in a different universe, where normal human problems exist, rather than the basic survival challenges that define your daily existence. You develop appreciation for simple continuity, waking up alive, having enough food for another meal, maintaining adequate shelter for another night, that would have seemed pathetically minimal during your previous life, but now represents genuine accomplishment in circumstances that threaten these basic needs constantly. The sound of breakdown. Your voice changes from months of breathing, dust, smoke, and cold air that irritates throat and lungs in ways that create permanent hoarseness. Speaking becomes uncomfortable enough that conversation decreases further, adding vocal isolation to the social isolation that already defines most interactions with other miners who face identical problems. The farmer's cough develops a wet, rattling quality that suggests serious lung damage from exposure to conditions that civilized medical practice would recognize as dangerous, but which mining camp existence treats as normal occupational hazards. His breathing becomes audible from considerable distance, creating constant reminder of what this environment does to human bodies. Tools create their own soundtrack of suffering, the scrape of shovels against rock that never yields easily, the ring of picks against stone that refuses to break apart, and the splash of water in gold pans that rarely reveal anything valuable enough to justify the effort expended. Each sound represents labor that probably won't produce meaningful results. The constant background noise of hundreds of men performing similar tasks creates a cacophony that makes concentration difficult and rest impossible even during brief periods when you're not actively working. The sound of other people's desperation provides no comfort or companionship, only reminder that everyone faces identical struggles with similarly poor prospects for success. Wind carries sounds across the camp with clarity that eliminates privacy for personal conversations, arguments, or expressions of frustration that would normally remain private. Every emotional breakdown becomes public knowledge, and every moment of weakness gets observed by neighbors who are dealing with their own versions of the same problems. Your own breathing becomes labored from physical exertion at altitude combined with poor nutrition and constant exposure to dust that coats everything, including the inside of your lungs. The simple act of getting adequate oxygen requires conscious attention that would have been automatic under normal living conditions. Sleep brings little relief from the acoustic assault, as snoring, coughing, and movement from hundreds of men creates constant disturbance that prevents the deep rest needed to recover from each day's physical and emotional demands. Even unconsciousness doesn't provide complete escape from the harsh realities of camp existence. The weight of decisions. Every choice becomes potentially critical when resources exist in quantities insufficient to allow for mistakes or experimentation with alternatives that might prove wasteful. Deciding what to eat, where to work, how to spend limited money, and when to rest require calculations that could determine whether survival continues for another day or week. Your daily routine gets structured around decisions that would have seemed trivial during your previous life, but now carry consequences that could prove serious or fatal if made incorrectly. Which tools to use, how long to work, where to seek shelter, and what risks to accept all require careful evaluation of factors that change constantly. The farmer faces increasingly difficult choices about whether to continue working despite his worsening illness or rest in hopes of recovery that might not occur before his limited resources run out entirely. His decision affects not just his own survival, but the economics of your small group that depends on everyone's contribution for basic financial stability. Medical treatment requires choosing between immediate relief and long-term financial survival, as caring for health problems costs money that might be needed for food, shelter, or tools essential for continued income generation. Getting well becomes luxury that most miners can't afford, when being sick means earning nothing while expenses continue. Equipment maintenance presents constant dilemmas about whether to repair tools that work poorly or invest in replacements that might not perform better, but definitely cost more than available resources can easily accommodate. Wrong decisions about gear can eliminate weeks of modest profits in single purchases. Your relationship with risk changes fundamentally as circumstances eliminate the safety nets that civilized society provides to cushion the consequences of poor judgment or bad luck. Every decision becomes gambling with stakes that include basic survival rather than mere comfort or convenience. Planning requires balancing current needs against future requirements when both compete for resources that exist in quantities insufficient to satisfy either adequately. Short-term survival often conflicts with long-term success in ways that offer no comfortable solutions through ordinary decision-making processes. The banker's analytical approach to choices becomes increasingly urgent as his calculations reveal how narrow the margin for error has become and how few options remain for correcting mistakes before they prove fatal to individual or group survival prospects. The arithmetic of endurance. Your body adapts to conditions that would have seemed impossible to survive during your comfortable life back home, developing capabilities and tolerances that surprise you with their resilience, while simultaneously revealing limitations that become more apparent each day. Physical endurance becomes measurable resource that must be managed carefully to prevent complete depletion. Sleep requirements adjust to accommodate circumstances where adequate rest isn't available, allowing you to function on amounts of sleep that would have been insufficient under normal conditions, while accepting reduced mental and physical capacity as the price of continued survival in harsh environment. Hunger becomes background sensation rather than urgent demand, as your body learns to operate on nutrition levels that would have seemed inadequate for basic health maintenance during your previous existence. The constant awareness of insufficient food affects concentration and energy, but doesn't prevent continued functioning. Your hands develop calluses and scars that mark the transformation from soft merchant to hardened laborer, though the process creates permanent damage that affects dexterity and comfort in ways that will probably persist long after mining camp existence ends, if it ever ends at all. Tolerance for discomfort increases dramatically as circumstances eliminate alternatives to accepting pain, cold, hunger, and exhaustion as normal rather than exceptional conditions that require immediate attention or correction. Suffering becomes routine background experience rather than problem requiring solution. The farmer's declining health provides constant reminder of how quickly human bodies can deteriorate under conditions that push physical systems beyond design limits. His visible weakness serves as preview of what extended exposure to mining camp conditions does to people who can't escape before permanent damage occurs. Mental resilience develops alongside physical adaptations, allowing you to continue making decisions and performing tasks despite emotional states that would have been paralyzing under normal circumstances. Psychological endurance becomes survival skill rather than personal characteristic. Your capacity for hope adjusts to accommodate reality, where improvement seems unlikely while complete failure remains possible, creating emotional equilibrium that allows continued effort without the optimism that originally motivated this entire venture. Persistence becomes mechanical rather than inspired, but it continues nonetheless. The geography of loneliness. The proximity of other human beings provides no real companionship when everyone is too focused on individual survival to maintain the social connections that normally provide emotional support and community belonging. Your conversations with fellow miners become increasingly transactional, focused on practical exchanges of information about work conditions, supply availability, or weather, rather than the personal sharing that creates genuine human relationships. Emotional connection requires energy that survival demands for more essential purposes. Letters from home arrive with decreasing frequency and feel increasingly disconnected from your current reality, as the gap between your experience and your family's understanding grows too wide for meaningful communication across distance that's measured in more than miles. Their world and yours operate according to completely different rules. The farmer withdraws further into himself as his illness progresses, requiring help with basic tasks while becoming less able to contribute to group activities or maintain the relationships that provided structure during earlier phases of this journey. His isolation affects everyone's morale while creating practical burdens that strain limited resources. Memories of social interactions from your previous life become precious and fragile, like treasured objects that must be handled carefully to prevent damage. Recollections of dinner parties, community gatherings, and family celebrations feel increasingly dreamlike and impossible to reconcile with current circumstances. The banker continues his methodical documentation, but writes increasingly brief entries that focus on practical observations rather than personal reflection or emotional processing. Even his systematic approach to recording experience adapts to conditions where introspection competes with survival activities for mental energy. Trust becomes impossible to maintain when everyone faces pressures that could make desperate behavior seem reasonable or necessary for continued survival. The social bonds that normally hold communities together weaken under stress that pits individual needs against collective welfare in ways that rarely resolve comfortably. You begin to understand how quickly civilized behavior disappears when the institutions that support cooperation and mutual aid can't function under conditions where basic resources exist in quantities insufficient to meet everyone's minimum needs for survival and basic dignity. The texture of violence. Disputes over claims, tools, and resources escalate more quickly to physical confrontation when exhaustion, hunger, and desperation eliminate the patience and social restraint that normally allow civilized resolution of conflicts between people with competing interests or different perspectives about fair distribution of limited opportunities. Your awareness of potential violence becomes constant background concern that affects every interaction with other miners who might view your modest success as opportunity rather than evidence of fair reward for honest labor. The absence of reliable law enforcement means that strength and willingness to fight often determine outcomes more than principles of justice. Arguments about water rights, boundary lines, and equipment usage carry undertones of threat that would have been unthinkable during your previous life, where community standards and legal institutions provided alternatives to physical force for resolving disagreements between neighbors and business associates. The farmer's weakness makes him vulnerable to exploitation by men who might take advantage of his inability to defend his claim or his share of group resources. Protecting him requires vigilance and potential confrontation that adds another layer of stress to existence already overwhelmed by survival challenges. Weapons become more visible as tools that serve purposes beyond hunting or equipment maintenance, though nobody discusses their defensive applications directly. The presence of guns, knives, and mining tools that could prove dangerous creates atmosphere of potential conflict that affects every social interaction. Theft occurs regularly despite the desperate circumstances that make everyone understand how losing essential supplies or equipment could prove fatal. The psychology of desperation creates logic where taking from others seems more reasonable than accepting personal failure, or admitting that this entire venture was misguided. Sleep becomes less restful due to awareness that relaxing vigilance could invite problems from neighbors who face identical pressures and might conclude that survival justifies actions that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances where basic needs don't require constant attention and desperate measures. The informal justice system that develops operates through mechanisms that favor quick resolution over careful consideration, creating outcomes that might satisfy immediate need for order while failing to address underlying causes of conflict that result from too many people competing for resources insufficient to support current population. The mathematics of failure. Your original calculations about time required to accumulate sufficient wealth for comfortable return home prove laughably optimistic when compared to actual daily income that barely covers basic survival expenses even during periods when gold extraction exceeds normal disappointing yields. The arithmetic reveals systematic problems that can't be solved through harder work or better technique. The banker's final accounting shows total expenditures that exceed total income by margins that represent complete financial failure, despite finding gold regularly and working every day under conditions that would have seemed impossible to endure during your previous comfortable existence. Success at mining doesn't translate into success at accumulating wealth. Equipment replacement costs continue consuming whatever modest profits get extracted from claims that produce just enough gold to maintain hope, while never providing enough value to justify the enormous investment of time, effort, and health that this venture has required from everyone involved. Food expenses alone consume most daily income, even when meals consist of basic staples prepared with minimal attention to nutrition or taste. The cost of simply staying alive eliminates any possibility of saving money for future security or eventual return travel that would require resources currently devoted to immediate survival needs. Medical costs for treating injuries and illnesses that result directly from working conditions add unpredictable financial burdens that can eliminate weeks of careful saving in single expenses for care that wouldn't be necessary under civilized living conditions where basic health maintenance doesn't require professional intervention. Credit obligations accumulate faster than income can service them, creating debt relationships that trap miners in cycles where working harder simply allows continued survival rather than progress toward financial independence or accumulation of wealth that could support families depending on remittances from California goldfields. The few miners who achieve modest financial success do so through means other than actual gold extraction, supply businesses, claim speculation, or exploitation of other miners' labor rather than the honest individual effort that motivated most participants in this venture. You begin to understand why so many men look hollow-eyed and desperate, despite being surrounded by gold deposits that supposedly represent unlimited opportunity for anyone willing to work hard under difficult conditions. The sound of surrender. Your fellow miners speak less frequently about plans for returning home wealthy and successful, as the gap between original expectations and actual results becomes too large to bridge through optimistic projections about future improvements that show no signs of materializing despite months of continued effort under increasingly difficult conditions. Conversations about California gold shift from excited speculation about wealth and opportunity to practical discussions about survival strategies and exit planning for men who understand that this venture will not produce the results that justified abandoning previous lives and investing everything in pursuit of dreams that prove unattainable. The farmer's condition continues deteriorating despite rest periods that the group can barely afford, and medical attention that costs more than his reduced productivity can generate. His illness serves as visible reminder of what extended exposure to mining camp conditions does to human bodies that weren't designed for such sustained abuse. Letters home become increasingly difficult to write, as truthful description of circumstances would horrify recipients, while false optimism feels like betrayal of family members who trusted your judgment about this venture and made sacrifices to support your pursuit of opportunities that don't actually exist. Your voice changes when discussing future plans, losing the confidence and enthusiasm that once characterized conversations about California possibilities and replacing them with careful neutrality that avoids commitment to outcomes that experience suggests are unlikely to occur regardless of effort or determination. Sleep brings dreams about failure and return rather than success and wealth, as your unconscious mind processes the accumulating evidence that this entire venture was based on false information and unrealistic expectations about conditions that favor suppliers over producers. The banker abandons his detailed record, keeping in favor of brief notes that document daily survival rather than progress toward goals that no longer seem achievable through ordinary methods available to individual miners working under current economic and physical conditions. Even basic conversation requires energy that survival demands for more essential purposes, creating social isolation that compounds the psychological pressure of recognizing that years of life have been invested in pursuit of opportunities that probably never existed in forms advertised by newspapers and promotional materials. The weight of understanding. The realization arrives gradually rather than suddenly that you've been systematically deceived about the nature of gold mining, the economics of extraction, and the living conditions that define existence in California mining camps. The deception wasn't necessarily intentional, but its effects on your life and future proved devastating regardless of original motives. Newspaper accounts that motivated your original decision to abandon comfortable life and invest everything in westward travel described conditions that bear no resemblance to actual circumstances faced by ordinary miners who lack special knowledge, superior equipment, or business connections that determine success more than individual effort or determination. The few men who profit consistently from California gold operate supply businesses, transportation services, or claim speculation rather than actual mining work that produces minimal returns despite requiring maximum physical effort under conditions that damage health and eliminate normal social development. Your understanding of economics shifts to accommodate reality, where finding gold doesn't guarantee keeping gold when living expenses, equipment costs, and credit obligations consume whatever value gets extracted from claims that produce just enough success to maintain hope while never providing enough profit to justify continued investment. The gap between expectation and reality proves too large to bridge through positive thinking or renewed effort, as circumstances result from systematic factors rather than individual failure that could be corrected through better technique or harder work under conditions that already demand everything you can provide. The farmer's declining health demonstrates the long-term consequences of mining camp existence for men who can't escape before conditions cause permanent damage to bodies and minds that were healthy when this venture began, but can't withstand indefinite exposure to deprivation and stress. Your relationship with your own judgment changes as evidence accumulates that major life decisions were based on incomplete and misleading information about opportunities that sounded reasonable when presented through promotional materials, but prove unworkable when tested through actual experience. The possibility of returning home successful disappears entirely, replaced by calculations about whether return is possible at all, given current financial resources and physical condition that may not support travel back across terrain that nearly killed you during the journey west. The arithmetic of loss. Your final accounting reveals complete failure measured by any standard that would have seemed reasonable when this venture began, with optimistic calculations about time, effort, and financial investment required to accumulate sufficient wealth for comfortable return to civilized life and family relationships that now seem impossibly distant. The money spent on supplies, transportation, and basic survival expenses could have supported comfortable existence for years in your previous location, where housing, food, and social services operated according to reasonable economic principles rather than the exploitation that defines California mining camp commerce. Health costs continue accumulating as your body shows signs of permanent damage from months of inadequate nutrition, constant physical stress, and exposure to conditions that civilized medical practice would recognize as dangerous to basic biological functioning and long-term survival. Time invested in this venture represents years that could have been spent developing business relationships, maintaining family connections, and participating in community activities that contribute to normal human development rather than the reduction to basic survival concerns that characterizes mining camp existence. The farmer requires care that exceeds group resources while being unable to contribute productivity sufficient to support his own basic needs, creating financial and emotional burdens that affect everyone's survival prospects and psychological stability in circumstances that offer no comfortable solutions. Your relationship with your family suffers damage that may prove irreparable as communication becomes impossible across the gap between their continued normal development and your reduction to concerns that they can't understand, because civilized society protects people from such extreme circumstances. Personal possessions that represented connection to civilized life and social identity have been sold, abandoned, or destroyed during the process of adapting to conditions where survival requires eliminating everything except immediate necessities that contribute directly to continued existence. The person who eventually returns home, if return proves possible, will be someone fundamentally different from the individual who left with confidence and optimism about opportunities that prove to be mirages designed to separate hopeful people from their savings, health, and normal human development. You fall asleep wondering whether the knowledge gained through this experience justifies the price paid for learning that California gold exists primarily to enrich people who never touch a shovel but profit consistently from other people's desperate labor and impossible dreams. You've learned that finding gold and keeping gold are two very different things. The mining camps have taught you that survival isn't about striking it rich, it's about not starving, while you watch everything you once were slowly disappear into the mud. But what happens when desperation turns men into something worse than animals? What happens when the hunger for gold becomes literally a hunger that gnaws at your soul? Join us next time as we dive deeper into the heart of darkness that was the California Gold Rush, where the real mining happened in men's hearts, and most of what they found there wasn't worth keeping.